And a very pleasant good morning to everybody. It is Monday, June 18th, 2018, and you are tuned in to a very special edition of the Connoisseurs of Wrestling. As you know, we're on a different day today. We got preempted by Money in the Bank. So if you're listening, congratulations. You survived the albatross of suck that unassuredly was Money in the Bank. We're going to help you get over some of your hangover blues here this morning with some classic wrestling goodness with the Connoisseurs of Wrestling. We got a very special episode today. Boy, there's a lot going on right now. It's Connoisseurs of Wrestling Week in the nightly thread. Of course, you know by now we have our special countdown of the top 10 wrestling families of all time going on. The DiBiase family comes in at number 10. Be sure to check in tonight on the nightly for number 9. We also have our Connoisseurs of Wrestling fan selection series going on here for our Hall of Fame show in August. Ric Flair is the runaway winner from Group A. We'll be talking about Group B here momentarily. And, of course, today's show being preempted by last night's pay-per-view. We're going to have an excellent show for you. We have a special guest in the house who we're going to introduce here momentarily. But, of course, we can't begin an episode of the Connoisseurs of Wrestling without throwing it to the curator. She is the glue that holds the show together, the straw that stirs the drink, the love of Taker's life, and the illicit love of mine. Legends lover herself, LL. I know you're not feeling so hot today. How you doing?
Doing pretty good.
Now, I want everybody to remember here, LL is a trooper. She is not feeling very good. Of course, you know that got some major events coming up with her, so I want everybody to keep her in your thoughts. And, of course, we also need to keep Taker's minion in our thoughts as well, because Taker, you, my friend, are going to be having quite a lot of responsibility placed on your shoulders coming up. So how you doing, my year older friend?
I'm doing all right. I'm tired. I just I'm home from work as we record this.
It's the magic of recording.
Yes.
I say it's Monday, but it's actually Sunday, but they don't know that because this is going out on Monday.
But now they do, so the cat's out of the bag.
Hey, it's all good. I mean, happy birthday, Mr. President.
Yes, it was last week.
Mm-hmm.
And today is as of recording this show, it is Father's Day. I got my gift early. Got my gift yesterday. It was a combo gift.
I was about to say, I don't count as your birthday gift and your Father's Day gift, so you'll have to choose.
I'm like that with LL sometimes on certain things, and, because of the size and the costs and all that stuff. And yes, it's the coffee table book that was published in 2016, the Encyclopedia of Sports Entertainment, the definitive edition, put up by WWE. And believe it, I was looking through it yesterday, and it's got everything. It talks about old promotions. It talks about wrestlers that no one has heard of. Not even you, Biff, and you know quite a few old ones. But yeah, I was looking through it going, and the blurbs are short and to the point.
I was just shocked that it had Scrap Iron in there. Scrap Iron is becoming the unofficial mascot of the show. So
George Gadasky, yes.
Oh, good Lord. We'll be talking more about
his signature move was the arm drag.
Wow. Nice. Way to reach out there and touch somebody, George. Okay, and on that note,
the thing about with him was that he was the proverbial jobber in AWA. He jobbed to everybody. I never saw that man win a match. Never.
Well, the Connoisseurs of Wrestling prides itself on having only the best talent here. This is a no-jobber zone. And on that note, we have to introduce our special guest. He may root for jobber sports teams, but he is no jobber himself, of course. He is a very popular and ever-present member of the Cageside Seats family of posters. He's making his very first appearance here on the Connoisseurs of Wrestling. We are breaking him in gently today, ladies and gentlemen. He is the one, the only, our friend, Mr. Fitzpatrick. Fizzy, hi. Oh, I'm sorry, it's Adam Rice. No, how you doing, Adam?
Oh.
Wow.
I got ribs and I don't know how to feel about it.
I swear to God on my life, I thought of that on the fly. I am so sorry. That was so mean.
No, I think it was funny.
It was funny, but Adam, in all seriousness, Adam is a
do me a favor, Biff. Can you pull the knife out of my ribs? That'd be lovely.
I am a dickhead. I am so sorry about that. No. Excuse me. In all seriousness, no, we're glad to have Adam on here today. We reached out and, I've talked with Adam a little bit here in the past, and I know that he's kind of like me. We're about the same age. He's right around my age, and we've both been fans for quite a long time. And, it's an honor to have you on here, Adam. We joke, we kid. Mox is rubbing off on me a little bit too much, unfortunately, but
I can tell.
I will try to limit my moxness here, and that's a great way, kind of the segue into the kind of the more serious aspect. For those who haven't got a chance to hang out with you much over at Cageside, well, tell us a little bit about yourself, specifically your wrestling fandom. We were talking a little bit before the show went on the air about some of your fields of expertise, but when did you start watching wrestling? Favorite promotions growing up, and are there any particular promotions that you kind of gravitate towards now as an older fan?
I started watching wrestling in the summer of, God, it'd have to be 1997. In that area, at that time, wrestling was starting to become talked about again in a mainstream level, and there were some kids I was running around with at the time who were not the greatest example of human beings in the world. But at that young age, they were wrestling fans, and they were talking to me about it. And I was finally like, okay, I need to check this out. And I hopped in on WCW Nitro back then in the mid to late 90s. And they were in the middle of the NWO Jay Leno stuff.
Oh, God.
Oof.
Brutal.
So that was my introduction to W. And then when I figured out there was this other promotion, WWF at the time, my first Raw I remember watching, I will never forget. It was right in the middle of the show, or towards the beginning. It was when Gangrel was running with the Brood, and my first introduction to the WWF was a bloodbath. And for those of you who are too young to remember what that is, get on your Google machine and look it up. It is when you are an impressionable young child, such as myself, that leaves such an indelible mark. When you see the lights go out and then when they come back on, someone's just covered in red, what looks to be blood. And so I was hooked from the get-go.
The Attitude Era is definitely a unique point of time in the business, and it's hard to explain what those times were like unless you lived through them. I came in, and I've told this before, I came in a little bit earlier, Adam, than you did, so I was a little bit more accustomed to it, but it was still so unlike anything we'd seen. Taker, you and LL can vouch for that. The Attitude Era was, let's just put it, a very strange but wonderful beast in its own grungy 90s way.
Yeah.
Yeah. But as far as the promotions I'm I gravitate to when I'm sitting in the wee hours in the morning. I love what, to me, the most easily translatable territory that you can bridge today with to back then with is Memphis. It just, there's something about it that it's more easily relatable, and then from there, I love watching old Crockett. I mean, watching Ric Flair and Magnum and all those guys, great.
It makes you golden in my eyes.
I've watched a little AWA. I'm baptizing myself in the way of Nick Bockwinkel with his promo, and thinking to my man was around today, how he'd be the toast of the wrestling world.
Yeah, Nick Bockwinkel's greatness cannot be understated. But we're definitely going to try here today because he's one of the focuses of our show. And I'm glad that you mentioned the AWA because, of course, as you see in our little episode title, we are looking today at the greatest families in the history of the AWA. Now, this is a very special episode. We have this planned out, of course, with the preemption. We're preempted every week that there's a WWE pay-per-view. Now, depending on how bad WWE pay-per-views might get, maybe you want us to not preempt so you have something else to do. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But we have a jam-packed show here for you today, and it's continuing on with our theme, celebrating Father's Day, especially since today, as we record this, it is Father's Day. Looking at some of the great families in the wrestling business. Of course, we have our countdown going on that we mentioned earlier. And today we have a very special show looking at the kind of the patriarchs of the AWA, the big families that kind of made that promotion what it is. We're going to be looking here today at three families in particular. And this is where I'm going to have our esteemed host, Taker's Minion, jump in on the conversation. When you're talking AWA, you can't really start any other place than with the Gagne family because for many people, just as WWE represents the McMahon family, the AWA really represents the Gagne family.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And he's got an interesting name. And in research, it says Laverne Clarence Gagne. Born 26th of February, 1926. Passed the 27th of April, 2015. He wrestled for close to 44 years. Was the owner of the AWA, created many great talents in the AWA, but during the national push that Vincent Kennedy McMahon did, lost a lot of his talent. And in the end, wound up shutting the doors. Because he would not move up with the times. He would not cultivate younger talent.
And explain what you mean by not cultivating the younger talent. Because I think, the story of the AWA being, folded up in the early 90s, I don't think that story gets told enough. Tell us what you mean when you talk about not evolving with the times.
Well, he was one of those types of people that, if he liked you and you gained his trust, which he didn't trust a soul, hardly trusted anybody. But I'm gonna give you a name. I'm gonna give you some names of people, and it's another veritable who's who of wrestlers that left, that were trained by him and eventually left. Ric Flair, Gene Anderson, Ole Anderson, Lars Anderson, Ricky Steamboat, Kurt Hennig, Bob Backlund, the Iron Sheik, Buddy Rose, Hulk Hogan. That's just a few. These were all young guys that were in this promotion that Vern had. He had a gold mine of people, of young talent. And not to mention he had Marty Jannetty and Shawn Michaels when they were a tag team as the Rockers. And they didn't build on, he didn't build for the future. He held on to the old code because he believed wrestling should be mat oriented, not the high flying stuff that was starting to come in the late 80s and into the 90s. You were seeing more and more of the cruiserweight stuff being done by heavyweights, more lucha style. And he didn't keep up with the times, and that's basically what put him out of business in the end.
Yeah, it was an unwillingness to kind of recognize where the wrestling business was going. And to be completely fair, that wasn't a trait that was specific to Vern. That was widespread in the Territorial era, especially in the 80s. It was just the business was changing, and for some, it was just a bridge too far to try and keep up with that. But, you know, we talk about Vern and, you know, his style. We look at that classic mat wrestling style that was pervasive in the AWA really throughout its history. And, you know, today with so many people doing, you know, high-flying, death-defying moves and kind of that 90s cruiserweight style showing its influence in the indie style that developed, that's now become, you know, part of mainstream wrestling in the WWE and even New Japan to an extent. It's interesting that some of that mat wrestling has really started to make a comeback with guys like Zack Sabre Jr., you know, people who are making a living off being excellent technical wrestlers. Zack Sabre Jr. would have been right at home in the AWA just by virtue of his talent. You know, it's just he's focusing on that grappling, catch wrestling, and that's why you see so many great names from the AWA. As LL, you know, has pointed out, it was about the wrestling, not the entertainment factor. I mean, wrestling, it was about the sport of wrestling. That's why you had guys like your Billy Robinsons, your Nick Bockwinkel's, great amateur skills there. You know, Vern, of course, was Olympic alternate in the 1950s before he kind of got into the pro game. So you have this strong pedigree of, you know, mat wrestlers, technical wrestling, catch wrestling, you know, physical toughness. That's kind of the interesting dichotomy in the AWA. You had kind of a split between your great grapplers and then your bruisers, you know, your fighters.
You think the bruiser.
The guys that were, you know, built like, you know, little brick factories there that would beat the crap out of you. And that's, you know, what made the AWA so special. And
damn, it was a sport.
Yes, it was legitimate sport in Vern's eyes.
Yeah, that was the thing. It was sports, not sports entertainment.
Yeah,
and that's where he failed. If he would have just a little bit, you know, loosened his grip on that concept.
The story.
I still think AWA would be around today. Greg would be running it, and it would be fine.
I think the story of Vern begins and ends with his undying need for personal loyalty. I think Vern was never going to put the belt on a guy he did not feel 100% comfortable in. If he even doubted you a little bit, you weren't sniffing the belt.
Yep, that's true.
And I think the story, we can tell this story maybe for another day, but the moment where Vern lost his battle in the wrestling wars wasn't in the 90s when they were taping shows for ESPN out in Las Vegas. It was at the Showboat. Vern lost the wrestling war the minute he lost Hulk Hogan.
Yep.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And
also, when he left his territory to try to get into Vince's territory, he tried to expand very fast, and he couldn't do it.
Vern, I look at Vern as a good soul. Vince, I'm gonna have a little fun here. If we're comparing the old wrestling territories and promoters to the New York Mafia, Vern was a soldier, but he wasn't a don. Vern understood what it meant to go in there and be a a worker, but his business sense, and when you compare it to someone like Vince McMahon, it was night and day. Vince had a vision.
Yeah.
And his vision was bigger than the New York territory. I don't think Vern could look past the AWA.
Well, he could. The thing is he tried to expand, but because he lost a lot of his good talent already, he couldn't make it.
Yeah, I think that bears mentioning there, because you're right. He did lose a lot of talent, and that was. This is what makes the 80s wrestling scene, and I'm not talking just about the talent in the ring and the quality of the territory shows. This is what makes the political backstage going on in wrestling so interesting in this period. Is you have people, like Vern, like Fritz von Erich down in World Class, and Crockett in the Carolinas, that they start having these ambitions of going national, and some of them actually made inroads into doing that. Of course, Crockett, probably the most of all the territory guys not named Vince because of the TBS overlay in the 80s. But Vern, he tried to go national. He got on ESPN to that extent. World Class tried to syndicate themselves nationally and promote their own world champion.
And let's not forget that Georgia Championship Wrestling started running shows up here in Ohio because of the old TBS station.
Yes, that was that national overlay kind of getting started. It's not that Vince, excuse me, it's not that Vince was the only one trying to go national. It's just like, Adam, like you pointed out, Vince had, kind of a different mindset from everybody else. He was focused on the marketing aspect. And I think that's where a lot of the other territorial promoters kind of lacked that capacity. The analogy you made was actually very spot on with it.
Yeah. Well, what made Vince, one of the things that made Vince over the rest is, you talked about AWA and getting on ESPN. That was near the end of the run. That was near the end of the run for AWA.
They were already in the deathbed by then.
They were in the death throes. WCCW was trying to syndicate, and eventually ESPN picked them up too, because I remember watching their stuff on ESPN during the afternoons. But what helped Vince is that he got into bed with NBC.
Yeah.
Okay. And Dick Ebersol, and all he'd have to do is send videotapes to the affiliates around the country. That's what got him in the door nationally. Vince was not he was taping shows, he would tape a show at, say, Madison Square Garden, for instance. And he had the weekly show every Saturday morning. I think it was Superstars of Wrestling or something, or Wrestling Superstars, something like that. I can't remember, so long back. That's what happens when you get old, people. You start suffering from sometimers. And the tape would be turned over to NBC. And the affiliates around the country would carry it. At that 11, I think it was 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. local on the NBC affiliate, local NBC affiliate. Because I know KNBC out in Los Angeles was actually owned by 30 Rock.
Well, one of these days, we're going to have to tell the story of how WWE got onto the USA Network the first time, because that in and of itself is one of those only in pro wrestling stories. It involves animal feces. We're not going to go too far down. Yeah, Adam knows. Adam knows exactly where we're going.
I don't know that story, so I went to look that up.
I'm not going to tell it in full here because we're going to go too far off the reservation of the show topic, but there will be an episode where we talk about WWE getting on USA. It involved Joe Blanchard making a boo-boo in Southwest Championship Wrestling, so that'll be a little teaser for everybody for a future show. But I want to pull something out that Adam mentioned earlier because I think it was important. And Taker, I'm going to get you to weigh in on this because I think that we've talked about this a little bit in the past, but you could elaborate on it. You're talking about Vern not being able to trust you unless you were, really tight knit with and close in. Explain why that phenomenon was so pervasive in the territories, the AWA included. Why was, top spots in territories, championships, why did you have to be really tight with the promoter, trustworthy, to even get a sniff of top level success during this era of wrestling?
Very simple. It's very simple. Vern, I'm going to use Vern as an example. Vern, we would require you to give a 6 weeks notice to finish up your days, finish up whatever feuds or whatever you were in. And you would have to work that. A lot of wrestlers that left Vern did not did not give notice. They just left. And that was one of the biggest things that was pervasive around all the territories. A guy who was could be a top star somewhere else would make a phone call. Let's say he was, let's use, I'm going to go back to that list real quick. Here did I see, I'm going to pull a name off of. All right. Let's say Jim Brunzell for that. Okay. Use Jim Brunzell as an example. Let's say he was, a breakout star. He should have had the title put on him by now. And, the fans are calling for it and everything like that. And it boils down to Georgia Championship calls him up, or he calls down to Georgia Championship and says, hey, this is what's going on with me. What can you do down there for me? And they would make their offer and he'd just go. He wouldn't give a notice. He'd just leave. That was the problem with a lot of the territories. People would just up and leave. No notice, nothing. I mean, the biggest example, the greatest example of it all was Stan Hansen when he did to Vern. Came in, had the title put on him, and Vern wanted him to drop the title before he went over to Japan. Yet in Japan, they were promoting him as the AWA champion. So he left, took the belt with him, went over to Japan as the AWA champion and worked his tour over there, and came back and wound up going to WCCW with the belt. When he finally returned it to Vern, he had run it over with his truck and sent it back to him. So he basically told Vern Gagne, get screwed.
In no uncertain terms, yeah. It was kind of one of those deals you just, a lot of political intrigue, a lot of...
It was politics. There was a lot of politics back then. I mean, Jesus, I'm looking at the thing with his AWA stuff, and yeah, he, had Hulk Hogan. He had acquired him because he had been let go by WWF initially. This is Hogan. Hogan was the top draw, and he had finally agreed after having him feud with Bockwinkel, which is another family we're going to talk about. But he was going to put the belt on him, but it had one condition. And the condition was that he would receive the bulk of the revenue that Hogan made from merchandise and his matches in Japan. And Hulk told him no. Hogan said no.
Yeah.
Later on in 1983, he went back to the WWF.
Yeah, you can't tell the story of wrestling without the politics.
Here's something else. It was everybody here knows who the Iron Sheik is.
Yeah,
Gagne trained him, and he has alleged. Now there's nothing guaranteed. There's nothing written down or nothing that can be verified. That Gagne offered him a bribe to inflict career-threatening damage to Hulk Hogan's knee, to his knees, take his knees out. Yeah. Why? To me, that sounds like sour grapes.
Well, sour grapes, and it's all about them politics. It's, backstabbing, betrayal. It's who's loyal, who's not, who can you trust. It just goes around in circles. There's all sorts of stories like that where you'll have the political intrigue of somebody jumping ship or somebody's mad at this promoter. Of course, there was a pervasive threat. So if you were a champion in those days of being, shot on, basically, somebody's shooting with you, try and take the title. Harley racing Wildfire Tommy Rich would be kind of the most infamous example from this particular period of the territories. LL, I want you to jump in here for a second, because I know, with your fandom, you have a lot of experience with the AWA, that you have a good working knowledge of some of the goings on with the company. Talk a little bit about, your memories of Vern and, your impressions of this area that we're talking about.
Well, on the flip side of what TM said, when he was talking about the trust, remember you had Bobby Heenan over in the AWA. Bobby Heenan was going to leave. And what he did is he gave his notice. He gave a 6 weeks notice. He worked it off. He went down to Georgia Championship Wrestling, where he met Hulk Hogan. He then called Vern, because he was still on great terms with Vern, and he introduced Hulk Hogan to Vern Gagne. When Bobby decided to go back, Bobby was taken back in a heartbeat, because he did have Vern Gagne's trust.
Yeah.
So you got two extreme sides. One that if you're trusted, and one if you're not. Vern Gagne could be a very vindictive bastard. He could hold Pig. He could hold Nick. You're paying. He cheated you out of money, which is something he did to Jesse the Body. He cheated Jesse out of money. That's one of the reasons Jesse Ventura left.
Yeah.
That was another problem. Wrestlers didn't trust the promoters either.
No, definitely not. And there's an excellent story that kind of ties into this, and I'm going to have Adam jump in here on this. I'm going to put you on the spot here, Adam. So this is part of your induction into, crash course training for connoisseurs, guest spots. Super Class 3. Are you familiar with that show? Because I think this is a perfect example to kind of enlighten people listening that may not know much about the AWA, about kind of the seedier side of politics. And we're talking about the money here and what Vern basically did with the receipts from that show. Do you have any memories of Super Class 3 watching it after the fact?
Well, my issue, first off for me, is Super Class 3 happened roughly about a year and a half before I was born. So I don't have a lot of first-hand memories.
You weren't there live, let's say.
Yeah, but this was one of the Territory's attempts to stop Vince. They came together and said, let's put on a big show. The problem was every one of these promoters were out for themselves from the jump. There were talks of Vern stealing money, guys approaching other talent to come work for them. You couldn't. These guys naturally were so suspicious of each other. It's one of the reasons why Vince won. Because you could not put these people together in the same room without them wanting to gut one another.
Yep, I can make a very good analogy to this. And LL will agree with me on this. Both her and myself used to be professional truck drivers. Drove over the road. You could get 2 or 3 drivers to agree on one thing or another. Anything more than that, it turned into cutthroat. Because the owner operators, because we have been on both sides of the coin. We have been owner operators and we have been company drivers. And the owner operators don't trust the company drivers, and the company drivers, owner operators don't like the company drivers, and the company drivers don't like the owner operators, and we don't like the union drivers, period. and we could never get our shit together to actually cripple this country if we wanted to. So, yeah, that's the same thing you could say about promoters back then. They were a bunch of goddamn truck drivers that could not trust one another.
And with the wrestlers itself, when I brought up Jesse Ventura, Jesse told a story of a match that they had that Vern and Greg went on vacation. Instead of paying the wrestlers what they were supposed to get paid, they took their money and went on a vacation.
Oh, yeah, the vacation matches. Yes. It was an annual thing with Greg and Vern. They would say they're going to pay the wrestlers X, but yet when the gate receipts came in and everything, they would always say, "Oh, we didn't have as much of a gate as we thought." Blah blah blah, and they were taking a larger percentage of the gate so they could go on their fishing excursions. That's what it boiled down to.
Go ahead and jump back in there, Adam. You had a point that you were going to bring up.
The old, someone stole the receipt bag out of the office. The big issue when it comes to Vern, and when you think of something like Super Clash, think about Super Clash 3 for a second. This was the event where they united two of the major promotions' world championships. Lawler versus Kerry Von Erich. AWA versus World Class. And Lawler goes over. And he does this big moment. But in the back, someone, inevitably someone was bitching about Kerry losing. Most likely. Fritz was.
Yeah. Papa Von Erich.
And so, and here's another thing, Greg was on that card. Greg went over Ronnie Garvin.
Wow.
Yep.
I'm so glad you brought up Greg. Now, and I want Ella, if you can, I want you to jump in here as well on this, because I know we've talked a little bit off air about Greg Gagne. And, we are looking at the families, and you can't mention Vern without mentioning Greg, because Greg was just as much a part of the AWA in the 80s, 70s and 80s as Vern was. And, we're looking at someone in Greg Gagne who occupies a really weird place in wrestling history, because we laid out at the start of this series on families, there's generally two basic types of second or third generation wrestlers. Either they get it and are huge stars, or they are absolutely terrible at it. Greg Gagne kind of falls in between, where he never had the respect of his father, and he was always kind of knocked on a little bit for his wrestling ability. Yet at the same time, he actually was quite proficient in the ring and had some success in the AWA. He never quite escaped from his father's shadow, though. Ella, if you can, talk to us a little bit about Greg Gagne, your memories of him, and what your perception of him was as a fan.
Well, I remember him more as a tag team. Him and Jim Brunsell. They were great together. The High Flyers were a great team. Excuse me. When they've won the championship a couple of times, but when he went to be a singles wrestler, he was more mediocre. Like you said, he couldn't get out of his father's shadow. But he could wrestle, and people just looked at him. That's Vern's son. He don't count. So He was caught between a rock and a hard place. He went to different promotions, but he didn't do very well. And I believe it's because he was Vern Gagne's son.
Yeah, take or elaborate on that a little bit. We've touched on that a little bit here, but let's refresh. Why was it so hard for people with famous fathers in the wrestling business to kind of break out on their own?
It's very simple. the long shadow that the patriarch puts out over the children. You know, oh man, here we go again. I'm gonna take a small detour here. And Adam, this is kind of a dig on you, so just deal with it for a second.
I'll deal with it for however long I need to.
This has to do with Charlotte Flair.
Yeah.
Oh, Lord.
Ric Flair was the dirtiest player in the game. That's his moniker. That's what he was. He was the heelest of heels. Everybody, and I say everybody, including you, Adam, are saying Charlotte needs to go back to being a heel. No, Charlotte don't. Charlotte's trying to get out from under her father's shadow. Let her be a face. She's starting to get it. She's getting over with it. Let her run with it. Let her be herself.
I completely agree with that. The
minute you try to force someone to be like their father, they're going to suck at rest. They're going to suck at whatever it is. And Biff, you know this too. I've used the NASCAR analogy as well. The Dale Senior versus Dale Jr. It's no different in wrestling. But there's one thing I could say about Greg Gagne in this situation. He was smart enough to realize that if he became the AWA World Heavyweight Champion, that no one would accept it because he's Vern's son. That's the only reason he was given the title, is because he was Vern's son, and he didn't want that. Vern wanted to put the title on him, but Greg said, "No, don't. I will never be recognized as legitimate because of who I am."
I just want to piggyback off of that real quick. There is nobody when you talk about father and son combos and now father daughter combos, as that becomes more prevalent. Sit back and realize when it comes to Vern, just how big his shadow was.
Yeah.
Vern, for people who don't realize, Vern came into professional wrestling at a time where there really wasn't the territories as we know it. There were offices.
Yes.
Minneapolis had an office. Chicago had an office. Columbus had an office. New York. The territories weren't as defined. And what Vern did is he came up at a time when wrestling started to get onto television. In the mid-50s, there was no bigger star in the Midwest than Vern Gagne.
That's true.
And Vern made a lot of money being on TV. And what Vern did was, later on in his wrestling career, was he bought into the Minneapolis office. And by buying into that, he got a piece of the action. And as time rolled on, he became the head guy. So not only did Greg have to deal with his father being the boss, Greg had to deal with the fact that his father was a megastar on a very big level.
Yeah, and I'm gonna you piggybacked on something Taker mentioned. I want to piggyback on something you mentioned there. It's something that we've danced around, but we've never really gone into it deep. And it's so important here when we're talking Vern. You mentioned buying into an office, and like you said, in the 1950s, when we're talking about the ye olden days of wrestling on TV, we're talking about the era of the Dumont Network. Mm-hmm. Look up the Dumont Network and marvel at the fact there used to be an old broadcast network other than ABC or CBS in those days. But we're talking about periods in time where the territories, like you said, weren't well defined, but they had offices in the different cities. Charlotte had one. Jim Crockett Sr. bought into that. That's why the Crockett family kind of became the center of the Carolinas territory. Vern bought into the Minneapolis office because he was from Minnesota. And when you see these wrestlers, you know, this is not just a scenario in the 50s that played out. This is something that kind of played out throughout the Territorial era. You'll see wrestlers that get hot in a territory. You know, Fritz Von Erich down in Texas, he bought into the office in Dallas, and this is what established him having the capacity to kind of take over the world-class territory when it formed. You see this in Memphis. Jerry Lawler got so big and so hot as a star, he bought a piece of the office. And this is how Jerry got into the management side of the Memphis territory.
Eddie Graham.
Eddie Graham, exactly. It's any time you have a major wrestler in a territory, whether it's Eddie Graham in Florida, Ole Anderson did it in Georgia, the Briscoes did it in Georgia too for a time. Vern in Minneapolis with what would become the AWA. The wrestlers that had
Corey Senior in Amarillo.
Exactly. It's
Dick the Bruiser in Indianapolis.
Dick the Bruiser in Indianapolis. It is a who's who. It's like one of the few territories that didn't have a wrestler in charge at any one point would be Vince McMahon's WWF, Vince Sr., and Vince Jr., of course, followed after him. But almost every other territory, at some point, you see a wrestler with control, whether they're owning it, whether they're booking it. That's because these wrestlers get so hot, they buy a piece of the office. And so that's why you have this nebulous framework of territories all over the country where you've got old ex-wrestlers running it. And to the point that both, you know, we've all kind of raised at the earlier part of the show, this is what set the WWF and then the WWF, of course, now WWE, apart. It wasn't so much a wrestler running the show in New York, it was a businessman. And when Vince Jr. comes along, you have a businessman that's got a promoter's mindset, but he also has a vision towards marketing. And that's something that a lot of the wrestling personalities in the business did not have. And so, but, you know, you're talking about buying into the office. You know, Vern buys himself a piece of the Minneapolis office. And when the NWA Championship conundrum, you know, takes place where the promoters don't want to give him the championship, it basically allows him to split the Minneapolis office off from the other major offices associated with the NWA. This is how we get the AWA. So this is, you know, just an interesting part of the wrestling business, and it just goes to show you that if you dig deep enough, you're going to find some interesting material about the politics involved.
When we were talking about Vern Gagne's trust, there was one particular wrestler he trusted more than anybody. And that leads into the second family, Nick Bockwinkel.
Yep.
Absolutely. Nick. Oh, you can't say enough good things about Nick.
I wanted to devote so much time to Nick because if Nick Bockwinkel were alive today, getting into the wrestling business, I guarantee you he would be the biggest star again that we've ever seen. He doesn't get enough credit.
No,
not
Being
by
as good as he
winning.
was.
Not by winning, but his promos alone outdo anybody's.
Yeah. Now I won't. I'm going to get all three of you to weigh in on this because y'all bring up a great point. You know, Leanne, you were talking about LL. You were talking about the promos. Adam, you mentioned how, you know, he would still be one of the biggest stars in the business if he were around today. You know, I want y'all to weigh in on what Nick had in his character, in his, you know, personality, in his wrestling acumen. What to you made Nick such a great star? Adam, we're going to go with you, then I'll have LL and TM jump in as well.
As someone who didn't see him, all I have are videos. All I have are tapes.
You have tapes?
Okay, YouTube. I'm sorry.
Hey, whatever works.
Right.
That's right.
The thing that sticks out to me about Nick is that he just looks so comfortable. Like, this is what he was meant to do. We're bringing up Nick as a part of a family, ladies and gentlemen. For those who don't know, Nick Bockwinkel is a second-generation wrestler. And you're thinking some of you might be thinking to yourself, well, holy hell, he was old when I saw him. What do you mean he was a second-generation wrestler? Nick's father was a man by the name of Warren Bockwinkel, who was a I guess you can say mid-level, mid-card territory star back in the 40s. But the thing about Warren was he took such care in Nick's training that it comes out on the other side. For Nick Bockwinkel was trained not only by his father, but by then who many people still consider one of the greatest world champions of all time,
Luthez. Yep.
Yes.
Nick's debut match happened at the age of 16. His opponent, Luthez.
Wow. You talk about pressure. Oof.
So, in his opening match, he had to wrestle the biggest wrestling star of the time. And you can tell that had an impression on him because of how he carried himself later on into his time into the AWA. And Nick was a fine wine. He got better with age.
Yes,
He doesn't win his first world championship until in the AWA until I think he was 40. Most guys these days are thinking about wrapping it up at 40. And Nick was at the apex of his career. He was a prodigy at the end of the day. It's really kind of how you have to look at it.
Yeah. Vern got lucky in the sense that he had, basically a bedrock performer in Nick Bockwinkel, somebody that he could trust, someone that he could do business with, but somebody that was going to be excellent in whatever role they used him in, whether it was as a tag team competitor, as a champion. And LL, we have talked at length about Nick Bockwinkel and some of his, legendary matches and legendary runs with the AWA. A lot of people, when they hear Nick Bockwinkel, they may gravitate towards the thought of him as a champion, but as you can certainly attest, he was just as good a tag wrestler as he was a singles wrestler. Talk to us a little bit about Nick Bockwinkel as a tag team guy.
Well, even as a tag team, his partner, Ray Stevens, they were great together. They could be, because you figure Ray Stevens was dirty. He could be one of the dirtiest wrestlers around. But they held the belts, quite a few years.
5 or 6, something like that.
And Nick, out of that tag team, and even as a champion, he had the charisma. Everybody thinks Ric Flair is so charismatic. Ric Flair ain't nothing compared to Nick Bockwinkel. His charisma, soft-spoken, educated. The guy was a genius with words. Whether he's losing or winning, he was a genius with that. Even at the tag team partner, he was the genius of the tag team, the methodical one, where Ray Stevens was more of the scrapper. They were good together.
For the record, you just started World War III, possibly with the Ric Flair and Bockwinkel combination, but
it's true.
Well, this is the way I likened it, and I'm glad that you brought up this because I made this analogy before, and I think it works. Nick Bockwinkel and Ric Flair, they don't have the same personality, but they have the same general character archetype. Nick and Rick were both...
They're the flip side of a coin.
Yeah, exactly. They're like the inverse of one another, but they're the same. They're the same type of character. They just have a different presentation. Nick would be your old money. He's the sophisticate. He's the connoisseur of the finer things in life. He's been there. He's done that. He has fine taste. He gets his suits tailored at all the old shops. You can imagine Nick Bockwinkel, enjoying a fine cigar in a lounge with other people drinking cognac after a 5-star meal, whereas Ric Flair is new money. He's like the Flash of the 80s. He's Miami Vice. He's rock candy for the nose. I'm not accusing him of cocaine. Okay.
But you watch some of those promos and tell me there wasn't cocaine involved.
There was chemical enhancements going on in the 80s for a lot of guys. Macho Man Randy Savage.
Where in the old days there wasn't.
Right, and it
was more beer.
Yeah, it was. I'm so glad you brought that up, though. It's that dynamic that makes Nick and Rick. This is why I wanted them to be a tag team so bad. It's like they're the same basic character type, but the presentation is completely different. But that's what makes Nick so great. He's something, even in that era, he's not something that you see coming down the pipe very often. He's unique in his intelligence, his intellect. You have intellectual heels, but Taker, there was nobody, and I mean nobody, that could match Nick Bockwinkel when it comes to class, to respect, and quite frankly, the total package of a main event star: in-ring ability, look, and his ability to cut a world-class promo.
There's something I want to say before you go on, as an analogy. When you think of connoisseurs of wrestling, think of Nick Bockwinkel.
Yep. I'm not going to argue that point because Nick was the god of the AWA for a very, very long time.
Not just the AWA, but a wrestler in general.
Yeah. I have to, I'm going to say this right now, ladies and gentlemen. I agree with Legends Lover here that Nick was far and away a much better wrestler, performer in general than Ric Flair was. Nick was trained, like you said, Adam, by Warren Bockwinkel, his father, and Lou Thez. So he was taught technical wrestling. He could be dirty when he needed to be, but Nick would more often than not win a match using his technical skills. Prime example: the very first time Kurt Hennig took on Nick Bockwinkel, everybody in the locker room, because he had a 1 hour, they were going to go 1 hour Broadway. That was the deal. Everybody in the locker room told Kurt, let Nick dictate the pace. Kurt didn't listen. 20 minutes into the match, Kurt was blown up. Why? Nick blew him up. He learned a valuable lesson. Slow down. That is the problem. Nick used the $10 words, the 8 and 9 syllable words, talking about intestinal fortitude. I have the intestinal fortitude to carry this type of with class and elegance.
Wait, you mean nobody else used the words obfuscate or bifocalization?
That's right. You don't hear that stuff today. He would do it in such a way that it would piss you off.
Yeah.
That was his gimmick. And I heard something just recently. They were talking about it. I don't remember where I heard it. But Nick Bockwinkel had a little dictionary that he carried around with about 70 or 80 words in it. And they were all big words. And he would study them, and he would learn how to use them in sentences properly and form the proper sentence to use the words in the proper context and syntax and all of that. He would spend hours putting together promos.
Your proverbial blue blood.
Yeah, he was a proverbial blue blood. He was a student of the game. He was a genius of the mental aspect and the psychological aspect of taking a crowd on a journey and telling a beautiful story, starting with the promos and ending with the match.
He could also be the flip side of Undertaker, where Undertaker played his mind games one way, Nick Bockwinkel played another way.
That's right. I mean, Jesus, people today, well, not today so much, but there's a wrestler that's currently on hiatus from WWE, I guess you could say, who's working over in NJPW right now. But back in 2008, excuse me, back in 2008, this wrestler based his character, his villainous character, on Bockwinkel, on Nick.
Yes, indeed. And
That is the one Chris Jericho.
Yep.
And it tells you that his style, and that's why when Adam says that Nick Bockwinkel, if he was in his prime today, would be a star, that's why, because you never really heard Nick Bockwinkel yell. He always talked calmly. He wore suits. He always dressed the part. He wore the expensive suits, but wouldn't brag about how much money he spent on him. He had class and elegance as a champion and as a heel. And that would piss everybody off. The working man would be pissed off that there's that rich son of a bitch up there using these words that I have no understanding of what the hell they mean. And he's talking down to me, ducking down his nose to me like I'm some piece of trash.
But in the ring, he could work.
But the ring, he could work his ass off. And he was great. He understood it. Yes, he was a prodigy.
What about him and Ray? The flip side of each other.
Jesus. Him and Ray, they would put on some great tag team matches. God, I used to hate them. I saw matches between them and Dick the Bruiser and the Crusher, and it would go an hour. It would go 90 minutes. It would be 2 out of 3 falls with a 90-minute time limit. And one side, each side would have one fall, and it would go Broadway, and the third fall would be a draw. And it's like, God damn it.
Well, like I said, you got one. Ray Stevens was more of a scrapper, a brawler. But then you had Nick, which was the technical. Get into your mind.
Yep.
People talk about Patterson and Stevens as a tag team the way I think they should talk about Nick and Stevens.
Abso-freaking-lutely. You're 100% right.
Bockwinkel and Stevens were incredible, and no one talks about them. They talk about Patterson and Stevens.
It's a travesty right now, and I'm going to say this, and I hope the WWE listens to this.
I hear a cat.
Yeah, that's me. I'm sorry.
That's it's a crying shame. Nick Bockwinkel's in the WWE Hall of Fame already, but it's an absolute crying shame that Ray Stevens is not.
Absolutely.
It's an absolute crying shame that Dick the Bruiser is not. It's a crying shame that the Crusher is not.
Yes.
These are wrestlers that, are all of them are great.
They're the foundation of what wrestling is.
Yeah. They're the bedrock. You can't tell the story of wrestling, especially in this era, without telling the story of guys like Dick the Bruiser, the Crusher, Nick Bockwinkel, thankfully, he did get the recognition in the Hall of Fame. But, your Bockwinkels, Gagnes, the AWA is in the heartland. It was the territory of the heartland. And in a lot of respects, it represented kind of the heartbeat of wrestling in the 70s and even into the early 80s. It's a fabric of wrestling history that was so influential. You still see the influences today, not only in some of the talent, the second, third generation wrestlers that are still going, but, the style of wrestling that the AWA perpetuated, the style that Florida perpetuated, or what was, prevalent in the Carolinas, and how these themes that the territories are bringing out, they exist today in different ways, and ways that, fans might not even recognize, but there's such a richness of history that has to be told. And you can't tell the history of wrestling without focusing on some of these great families that we've been bringing up here in the AWA. Of course, Nick Bockwinkel, it was said so perfectly, like a fine wine. He just gets better and better with age. And that is a great point in the conversation to bring up our match of the week. Now, Taker, hold on to your butt on this one, because I think you're going to enjoy this one.
Am I going to need to hold on to it with both hands or just one?
Yeah, go grab Legends Lover. Hold on tight. And Adam, you can jump in here on this one. If this excites you as much as it excites me, you're in good company. Get on the YouTube, and your official match of the week from Japan, Nick Bockwinkel has a special AWA championship title defense against one of my all-time favorite wrestlers, the great Billy Robinson. Nick Bockwinkel. I gave them the vapors, you can tell. Nick Bockwinkel and Billy Robinson. Oh my God, there's a couple of their matches on there. One of them goes about 45 minutes. Another one goes about 30. Some of them you have to search out for, but Nick Bockwinkel and Billy Robinson. Now, you talk about freaking awesomeness. Billy Robinson and Nick Bockwinkel for 30 minutes could do in that half hour what most people could never do in an entire career. They are great. That's our match of the week.
They had chemistry.
Yeah. Billy Robinson was a throwback in an era of throwbacks. He was Nick Bockwinkel was your favorite wrestler. Now, the guy you were watching then and you were enjoying. Billy Robinson was your grandfather's favorite wrestler because he was that classic catch-as-catch-can World of Sport style.
Why don't you, Adam? I'm sorry to interrupt you. Why don't you just say it? Billy Robinson was a great shoot fighter.
He was. He was a shoot wrestler in an era where there weren't very many left. And that's what made when him and Nick got together, classic matches. I can't find tapes of it, but Billy Robinson and Bill Dundee down in Memphis.
Holy Jesus, yes.
Billy Robinson and anybody. There was Billy Robinson and Lawler from Memphis.
Well, you know how we're gushing over Nick Bockwinkel. Billy Robinson was one of the few people that could make Nick Bockwinkel look uncoordinated. It was by design. It was that's talent, ladies and gentlemen. That's talent.
And I also want to bring up quickly when we're talking about Nick and his athleticism in the ring. What many people don't realize is that the kind of athlete Nick was. Nick, for those who don't know, used to play football. Yes, and Nick had a scholarship offer to the University of Oklahoma to play football. But because of a knee injury, he was unable to continue his football career.
That's correct.
So he was already a great athlete. It's just that his father and he was just molded. And I could go on forever about Nick. He's just the best.
You bring up a very, very crucial point. to all of this. Wrestlers from that era of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, mainly the 50s and 60s, all of them were football players.
Mm-hmm.
So was it. Vern Gagne, he was a professional. Can't remember if it was the Bears or the Packers.
Bears.
Yeah, it was the Bears, I think.
He played for the Bears. Nick was playing in college. Bruiser played for the Green Bay Packers, as did the Crusher. Both of them played for the Packers.
Another territory entirely, but Wahoo.
Wahoo played for the Jets.
Jets.
Oh, yeah.
Ernie Ladd played for the Kansas City Chiefs and the San Diego Chargers.
And how many great stars out of Texas played football at West Texas State? I mean,
Stan Hansen, Bruiser Brody, hell, Stone Cold Steve Austin went to West Texas State.
You're looking at that era. They didn't start in one sport. They played both. A lot of them did wrestling in at school and football. Either went to football first for professional and then into wrestling, or chose to take wrestling.
Mm-hmm.
But most of them all had a football background.
Yeah, they were just excellent athletes.
Yes, and that's the thing. Even though Nick had the bad knee, he still kept himself in impeccable shape. Even up until the day he died, he was in great shape.
You know, you look at some of the wrestlers today. There's quite a few of them that got football backgrounds. Roman Reigns, the Usos. They've got the football background first.
Yeah, the Usos, the Roman Reigns.
Baron Corbin.
Baron Corbin.
That category as well.
Yeah, Baron Corbin.
And there was this one guy, Dwayne Johnson.
The Rock, yeah.
Whatever happened to that guy? I wonder if he made it. Yeah.
He's still in movies.
Oh, the quitter.
But you look at the
John Cena
contrast.
played football in high school and college.
Yes, he did.
You look at the contrast between now and then. There's still the football background, the sports mentality.
Yep.
And not just football, but, like you mentioned, LL, the amateur wrestling.
The Steiner brothers.
The Steiners, Kurt, Jason Jordan. We would talk about Vern. My God, Vern was an excellent wrestler.
What about, you also got the weightlifting, Ken Patera.
Ken Patera, Mark Henry.
Dino Bravo.
Yeah.
Bruno, absolutely, Bruno.
Most of the wrestlers in the past, I'd say 90% of the wrestlers from the past, and then you got most from the now. They're all got the sports background, the physical, hard sports background to help them along.
I want to throw this dream tag team match out there because it just came to me and I just gave myself,
the vapors.
I gave myself the vapors. There's somewhere a hot flash. There we go.
You do that a lot.
I know. I'm an expert at giving myself, the tickle diggles. What the hell was that? Okay, never mind. Let's Control-Alt-Delete on that one. Sorry, guys.
You give yourself a lot of tickle me Elmos.
Oh, Jesus God Almighty! Remind me to tell you something all fair about Tickle Me Elmo.
Oh God!
Let me get this back on the reservation before the plane goes down. We still got a chance to miss the iceberg here on the Titanic. Billy Robinson and Danny Hodge against Ray Stevens and Nick Bockwinkel. You tell me that match.
Oh my God!
Wouldn't be glory.
That could be a pay-per-view in and of itself.
Yes.
That once here's another guy who just
has someone seen my pants?
Exactly. Here's another guy who does not get near enough the credit for being as good as he was. Danny Hodge. How was this man not in the WWE Hall of Fame?
Because Vince McMahon is stupid, but keep going.
Okay, I agree with that. But Danny Hans, if you could point to anybody as the progenitor of modern mixed martial arts,
Yep.
it's Danny Hans. Great amateur wrestler, took up boxing for the hell of it. And
won a title, if I'm not mistaken.
Golden Gloves. Yeah.
And then of course he was a great junior. He would be considered a junior these days, or a light heavyweight. But the man could just outwork you in a circle and had ungodly strength. It was just Danny Hodge. For those of you who don't know, look him up. Look him up.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right.
It's just tremendous. You know, we talk about the great, stories. We talk about the dream matches that we want to find or we wish could have happened. And it's just so great to be able to talk about wrestling in this way. And just to put a capstone on Nick, because there's another family we want to talk about that's great in a very different sort of way.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to get to here momentarily. Just to put a capstone on Nick's career, the AWA Championship, of course, obviously the creme de la creme of titles in the American Wrestling Association. There was only 2 men that held the title more often, or more times, I should say, than Nick. And one of whom we're about to talk about with respect to the Vachon family. Nick Bockwinkel held the title 4 times, but in terms of cumulative time held, so we're talking about the number of days that the title was around Nick Bockwinkel's waist. Outside of Vern Gagne, nobody else comes close to having the type of longevity that Nick Bockwinkel did with the title. He held the title for just under 3,000 days. We're talking Bruno Sammartino levels of championship excellence. That is the kind of man that Warren Bockwinkel trained his son to be. But, and this is a segue inserted with a chainsaw here, the number 3 man on the list, Mad Dog Vachon. And that's our final family that we want to touch on here today, because if you're talking about contrasts, if Nick Bockwinkel is your sophisticate, he's the clean-cut, clean-shaven, just that personification of class that the AWA represented with their champions. The Vachon family represents the other side of the coin, which is scrappy, pugnacious, generally bald if you're a man. Although Luna had her head shaved in parts too, so baldness was just kind of a trait of the Vachons. But you talk about a difference. The Vachon family were ass kickers. There's no other way to put it. Mad Dog, his name was Mad Dog, for Christ's sake. Mad Dog, the Butcher. You had just this visceral ass-kicking motif with the Vachon family that represented like the sharp contrast between your Nick Bockwinkels and your Crushers. That's just the glorious thing about the AWA. You have such a pointed contrast. So let's jump in on the Vachon to your family, because they're just as important as Nick and the Gagnes were to the AWA. LL, what can you tell us about the Vachon family? Who did you first see? And did you have I was going to say, Taker, you had something you wanted to bring out too. I forgot to mention this about the Vachon family. So I'm going to toss to you right quick. The Vachons. Kind of give us a little intro on what this family meant to the AWA and to wrestling in general.
Well, here's the thing. I'm going to start out when you have 2 brothers that go by the nicknames of Mad Dog and Butcher. You have to realize there is going to be tons of color involved. Tons and tons. Their matches were brutal, bloody, mean. They didn't care who you were. They would bite you. They did everything that the most nastiest of heels could do. Now, the funny thing about it, and here we go again with Maurice. They actually, there's 4 members that were wrestlers in the Vachon family, but there is another member of the Vachon family who shunned wrestling and was a big-time guy in the National Hockey League.
Oh.
Rogie Vachon is also a member of the same family. He's not a wrestler, but he's a NHL Hall of Fame goaltender. Played for the Montreal Canadiens, won a Stanley Cup. Played for the Los Angeles Kings for a lot of years, and it was the general manager of the Los Angeles Kings. So there's another Vachon that's not part of the wrestling family.
The Los Angeles Kings are a myth, but go ahead.
Yet they've won 3 cups in the last 7 years.
I choose not to remember that.
Yeah, because didn't they beat Carolina once?
No, Detroit did, but we're getting off the reservation. So.
All right, but no,
sorry.
The wrestlers. Let's talk about the wrestlers. Mad Dog and Butcher were 2 of the most visceral, evil people. They were what you would call, and this is slang for you smarks that don't understand the true slang. They were coolers.
Elaborate on that. What you mean by that?
You would have a face in a specific territory that was getting way too hot. So they would have to bring someone in from out of town. A manager down there I'm bringing in somebody from out of town, to do one thing, and that is to take you down. Mad Dog and Butcher were those type of people, along with Abdullah the Butcher. There's your 3 top coolers in professional wrestling during the Territory era, especially in the 60s and 70s.
Andre played that role too, but for heels as a side.
Right, as a heel, towards the heels.
Yeah. But
it was mainly that they wanted to get the white heat, the white meat baby face, the heat off the how hot they were. They want to cool them down a little bit. So they would bring in these guys, and Vern would send them for a fee.
Yeah.
But that's what they would do, is they go down there and they would take out the top baby face. Or they're, and I mean, they would be some of the most bloodiest matches you would ever see. And they would wind up winning. And then they would have to figure out a way to get them out of the arena without getting killed. But that's what their job were. That was Mad Dog and Butcher's job, was the cooler. Vivian, on the other hand, the sister, she wrestled for a very, very short time because of the accident that she was involved in. She debuted in 1969, and she retired in 1986. So she wrestled not even 20 years. She wrestled 17. I believe it was from injuries to her body, but I'm not exactly sure. But she learned from Mad Dog, her brother, and Moolah. And she was a very good wrestler herself.
She had a lot of respect in the business.
Oh, yes. I mean, she was someone that she had a mind for the business, too, and she was someone who dropped out of high school in 10th grade.
I want to put this out there, and Adam, you might have a connection to this too. This might be a little bit far back for you. I'm not sure. We'll see here. I'm going to put out a certain tape, and let's see if this resonates with anyone with respect to the Vachon family. Wrestling's bloopers, bleeps, and body slams. Anybody catch that reference?
I vaguely remember it. Yeah.
This is kind of the discrepancy between the WWF and the AWA, and I'm going to kind of touch on a lot of things we brought up here. You were talking, TM, about, the Vachons, their reputation as coolers, that kind of vicious streak. You got to be vicious if you're nicknamed the Butcher or Mad Dog. obviously.
Exactly.
Unfortunately for me, and this is unfortunate in the sense that it took me a while to kind of appreciate what, Mad Dog Vachon could do. Because he's probably, outside of Luna Vachon, who we're also going to talk about, he's probably the Vachon family member I know the most about.
Mm-hmm.
My first exposure to him was on a WWF Coliseum video release called Bloopers, Bleeps, and Body Slams. And it was basically the quintessential WWE food fight skit, where Mad Dog got married and they filmed the reception for WWF television because Mad Dog wound down his career in the WWF. And basically, all I knew of Mad Dog was that he liked to throw pies in women's faces.
Yep.
That was the big skit. I mean, this food fight turned pretty violent by today's standards. They started throwing tables and chairs at everybody, but it was just this kind of that comedic, goofy George the Animal Steel style of wrestling that the WWF did so well. So if that was your only exposure to Mad Dog Vachon, and Adam, you could testify to this too, because I know you've gone and seen some of their work. You're really missing a big part of the picture of what made guys like Mad Dog so great. It was not their comedic side that was portrayed in New York, but it was that brutal kick your ass style that they populated, especially in the Midwest.
The amazing thing about Mad Dog Vachon, the story of Maurice Mad Dog Vachon, is that he identified early in his career that something wasn't working. He made a change, got it over, and was able to then take it to a successive level each time. For those who don't know, who only ever saw Mad Dog as, the growling guy with the gravelly voice and the heavy Montreal French Canadian accent, that wasn't him his entire career.
No, it wasn't.
For those who don't realize, Mad Dog Vachon was an accomplished amateur wrestler in his own right.
Yes.
By the age of 14, he was already one of Canada's finest amateur wrestlers.
Yes, I'm going to touch on that real fast. I'm not meaning to cut you off, but
I'll let you get to it then. But it was later on, Mad Dog started his pro career basically as a what we would call a light heavyweight. He was a 5'7", maybe 170 pounds, 180 pounds. And that was the early part of his career. But it wasn't going anywhere. He was spinning his wheels. One day he decided, I'm going to shave my head, grow out my beard, and I'm going to put on about 30 pounds of weight. And I'm going to wrestle as a heavyweight and as a brawler. And one day he was working out in Portland for Don Owens. And one day during the match, he got out into the crowd and he started, doing what Mad Dog does. He's brawling. He's fighting. And he punched out a cop. Just for the hell of it.
Yep.
He got to the back, and Don Owens said, Maurice, you look like a mad dog out there. And that's how he got his nickname.
Yep.
Taker, I know you got some Mad Dog stories to share.
Oh, yeah, but I want to say this first because Adam brought up something very valid. Yes, Maurice Mad Dog Vachon was a very, very accomplished wrestler. Because the same year he debuted as a professional, which was 1950, Maurice won a gold medal in men's freestyle wrestling in the British Empire Games as a middleweight. The same year he became a professional wrestler.
And 2 years before that, he went to the Olympics.
Yes, he did.
Yes, he did.
1948, he was at Olympics.
And while he was in, he didn't place well. He finished only 7th. But that wasn't the big thing to come out of that. Because while he was over in England for the Olympics, he met an American Greco-Roman amateur wrestler by the name of Vern Gagne.
Yep.
It would be that connection that later on in Maurice's career, Vern placed a phone call to this guy he knew and asked him to come work for him. What Nick, and I'm going to make this comparison, and I want the people who actually were there to tell me if I'm wrong. For the early portion of the NWA, the relationship that Mad Dog had with Vern was just as important as later on as the relationship that Vern had with Nick.
Agreed.
They were two. Mad Dog Vachon and Nick Bockwinkel played the same role for Vern in 2 different times. It's why Mad Dog had the belt a lot in the early part of the 60s. Yeah, Vern could trust Mad Dog in the same way he could trust Nick Bockwinkel.
And that parallels because of the top 3 people to hold the AWA title, Vern Gagne obviously held it the most. He had 10 reigns and had the most days.
It helps when you're the booker.
Yeah, well, yes, it does, and we've extrapolated on why that was the case before. But when you're talking about the AWA champions, the top of the list is Vern, Nick, and Mad Dog. Nick had more days than Mad Dog did, but Mad Dog had more title reigns. So you're right. They're the same general role, even if they're not the same characters. They have the same general role for Vern in different time periods. Mad Dog held the title 5 different occasions. That's second only to Vern. And I think he held the title the 3rd most cumulative days behind Nick and Vern. So you're right. They have the same role to play in terms of being someone that Vern could trust and do business with. And you talk about the Vachons. It's interesting. Now, we can't compare them stylistically because the Briscoes were much more polished, technical wrestlers in their characters than the Vachon family would end up being, even though the Vachons did have that background, especially Maurice. But there was an interesting parallel between the Briscoes and the Vachons. And Taker, if you can, and if LL, if you have anything to add here, to jump in as well. It always seems like when you have a pair of siblings, and of course, in this case, there's Paul, there's Maurice, and there's Vivian. So you have 2 brothers and a sister here. But whenever you have this, family of siblings, there always seems to be one that has the lion's share of success while the other kind of exists in the shadow. We talked about Mad Dog a little bit, but we really need to bring up the Butcher, because he was just as important a part in the AWA that Mad Dog was, even if he didn't have the same level of championship success that the Mad Dog did. Any memories of the Butcher, Paul Vachon?
Yeah, I got one.
Okay, go for it.
I saw a match at Chicago's International Amphitheater. People, it existed. Look it up. Between Paul the Butcher with Ed Maurice the Mad Dog versus Wilbur Schneider and Dick the Bruiser.
Oh, wow.
You want to talk about a bloodbath? Everybody was bleeding after that match. And this was back in the time, folks, when the Butcher got his nickname, and I believe it is because he worked as a butcher in Montreal at one point, if I'm not mistaken. I have to check.
I believe you're correct on that.
And that's how that just was how it got put on him, was because he was a butcher. That's not saying. But anyway, they had a match there that went 45 minutes. And now, mind you, people today, back in the 60s and 70s, they didn't didn't know much about hepatitis. They didn't know AIDS didn't exist back then. A lot of the bloodborne illnesses were not well known back then. Maurice was known to actually bite the cuts on your head.
Mm-hmm.
As did Paul. Both of them would bite.
We have to step in a moment and just kind of remind people is that Mad Dog was legitimately crazy.
No, he was in the ring as a character. The Mad Dog was crazy, but Maurice the man, he was
smart.
He's another one that you could hear him talk away from the ring as Maurice and not as a Mad Dog. Highly intelligent.
I'm not doubting his intelligence. I'm doubting. For those who don't know, there's a story of the AWA used to have like a company plane, and Maurice one day decided to open the door.
I've heard this story before.
While they were in midair, and he's leaning out of the door, going, "Oh, look at all the pretty clouds." Like, what are you doing?
He kept kayfabe.
In them days, you never broke kayfabe.
You never broke kayfabe back in those days. That's why, back in ye olden days, the shit that goes on with the Sasha Banks and Roman Reigns and all of that. You know what would have happened in the ye olden days? If somebody would, come up and ask for an autograph and then they turned them down and people got shitty, they got their asses kicked.
And he did his fair share of that too.
He did it. Axe did it. Bruiser did it. Crusher did it. They all did it. They all kicked the shit out of you.
Ass kicking was their business, and
let's put it this way. And Elle could verify this because she lived in South Milwaukee. When Crusher would go out to a bar, he would have to notify the police department what goddamn bar in town he was going to, so they would have police presence close by.
Because patrons, everybody always didn't think he was bad, wanted to pick a fight.
They get them beer muscles going. Terry Lasowski, he's just a goddamn wrestler. It ain't real. It's fake. Yeah, until he kicks your ass all over the place. And he would not get arrested. They would.
In a video, or actually a show with Jim Cornette, Bobby Heenan talked about this. In these days, if you were a heel, you played a heel when you were out in public. If you were a face, you played a face out in public. You always stayed in character.
I heard a story about old Maurice Vachon. He was out at dinner. He was eating by himself, and someone came up and said something. I don't know what it was, but Maurice cleans off his fork and says, "You have made the greatest mistake in your life."
Yeah, I heard this story.
So
he proceeded to use the fork and stab the guy. I believe it was in the arm or the leg.
And then
with the fork repeatedly. Then, when he was done, he took the bloody fork and continued eating his meal.
There was another time he followed this one poor guy out. There was 4 other guys standing out on the other side of the street. So Mad Dog calls his brother and says, "Come down to so-and-so place where we're going to have some fun."
Yep.
And so he walks across the street, says one thing to another, and all of a sudden it's 1-on-4 and Mad Dog's winning. But here's the great part of this story. Mad Dog picks up this guy and he's going to throw him through a plate glass window. But Mad Dog trips and falls. Mad Dog gets up pissed off because he tripped. And he ended up kicking this guy so hard he split open his wing-toed shoes.
Yeah, wingtip shoes, yes. He split them up, yes.
So then after that, Paul pulls up in a taxi, and Mad Dog goes, "Oh, sorry, I took all the fun for myself."
These are the kind of people they were.
You notice
that's Mad Dog and the Butcher in a nutshell.
You notice the sharp contrast between the sophistication of Nick Bockwinkel and the 1-on-4 and the one is winning stories here with the Vachons.
But it speaks actually to Mad Dog's personal character, because he didn't really wasn't afraid of people, because as you guys know, back in those days, everyone had their own booking license. Everyone had their own promoting license. And many places you could only have one.
Right.
Well, Mad Dog went up to Montreal and used some of his connections and actually got his own promoting license in the same town as the Rougeaus.
Yes.
So, and they begged them not to give him a license, but because it was Mad Dog and you didn't know what would happen, they gave him one anyway.
Yes, these are all true stories about the Mad Dog.
So,
let's put it away. He had government officials intimidated.
He leveraged some connections and he got a promoting license in the same town. And I want people to understand, the Rougeaus ran Montreal.
Except when Maurice was around.
Exactly.
Hey, the Rougeaus were no slouches either. I mean, Ray Rougeau, Raymond had the ability to stand toe-to-toe with Tom Billington, and that's no small feat.
No.
Given Tom Dynamite Kid.
He stood toe-to-toe with Dynamite Kid. He also stood toe-to-toe with freaking Andre the Giant.
Yeah, so if Ray Rougeau is shitting in his pants in fear, you know you've got a reputation for being a badass.
And the thing about it that makes it even funnier is Maurice was 5'7".
Yes.
5'7" tall. And Paul was 6'2".
But the smallest guys are always the badasses in wrestling.
Exactly.
So.
That was one thing. That was one of the reasons why Mad Dog was so good, though, too, is that he had that small man's complex.
Yeah.
In the ring.
But what I appreciated so much about Mad Dog when you go back and look at him is that he really did have 2 chapters of his career. 3, really. You know, the early stuff where he wasn't getting over, the chapter where he turned heavyweight and had all that success.
Was a major heel, and then near the end of his career,
he was a tag team guy.
Organically, he was a babyface, but he still did all the heelish things.
Right, and a lot of the Vachons as a tag team happened kind of on the back end of his career, but he was still able to have momentous success with it because of his established persona.
There's some tag matches from 83, I want to say. It would have to be 82 or 83, of Mad Dog Vachon teaming up with Hulk Hogan in the AWA. And Mad Dog getting just as loud of cheers as Hulk Hogan is. And that's scary when you consider how popular Hulk Hogan was getting in Minneapolis in the summer of 83, that Mad Dog was just as popular despite being that, gravelly heel for so many years. And it speaks to both of what you're saying. It's, there was a certain level of respect. Mad Dog, he had a temperament outside of the ring. He was articulate, but he also had that wild streak in him. But it was to his character. And this is what newer fans need to appreciate about this era of wrestling. You had to be in character whenever you went out 24/7. Because kayfabe was the difference between having a job and not having a job. And people knock on guys like Jim Cornette and say they're old fuddy-duddies that can't get with the new times. Well, the reason is they were brought up in the wrestling business with the understanding if they broke kayfabe, they were out. This was your life. Mad Dog, this was his life. Yes, he had to protect his character. He had to protect the business at all times. I guarantee nobody, Mad Dog may be the one exception of wanting to get into a 1-on-4 fight because he knew he could win. But it's not that they wanted to go out and kick a lot of ass. It's that they had to protect their image. Because if, Eddie Graham, the famous story that so many wrestlers have told working for Eddie Graham, he wanted you to go and get out into the bars so that people could test you and you could whip their ass. Because if you whip their ass, they realize, wow, this guy's really tough. I want to go see him against the other tough guys. If you lost a bar fight in those days, you were out of a job. You would get your walking papers because they wouldn't want to have anything to do with you. Yep. Mad Dog would get in there and kick ass at an exponential level, not just because he enjoyed it, but because that was how you perpetuated your character. This was back before the lawsuits kind of dominated.
There's also the downside to that. Because if you did hurt somebody, then you were done also. Look at Ken Patera.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ken Patera, not the greatest career move.
No, but you figured sticking with kayfabe. And
Ken Patera was under the influence of some serious drugs when he did that too. Still
got to keep kayfabe. But look what happened. There's an upside and a downside to it. A lot of wrestlers ended up in jail and prison because of keeping up with kayfabe. But they also needed to keep their jobs.
Yeah, and LL, I'm so glad you brought that up because this is the point that needs to be mentioned. And we were touching on it, but we didn't go into it fully. And I think this is something that really deserves its own episode in the future, just kind of looking at the cost of the business. We talk so much, and you hear so many wrestlers talk about paying dues and getting into the business and how tough it was to break in and become a star. But there's an entire different level that isn't nearly as talked about, and that is the cost of the business. When you're talking about the AWA, and Ric Flair is kind of the poster child of this, that 30 for 30 documentary on ESPN did a good job of explaining kind of a glimpse of what this used to be like. But when you were a professional wrestling star in the 60s, the 70s, and into the 80s, you're working more matches often than there are days in the year. You're always on the road. You don't get to be home very often unless you were lucky enough to be in a short distance territory. So you're constantly traveling.
Or if you were injured, then you were off.
Yeah, if you were hurt, you got some time off. But if you were injured, that meant you don't get paid.
Right.
There were no guaranteed contracts. So you have to work through injuries a lot of times. And granted, you're not doing the kind of death-defying spots that today's wrestlers are, but they're also wrestling 2 to 3 times more matches a year. I think the average performer, the last couple of years before he got hurt, Dean Ambrose was working the most matches of anyone on the roster. He would generally work between 120 and 140 matches. Ric Flair talked about wrestling 380 to 400 matches in a year.
It was 7 days. It was 8 to 9 matches in 7 days. He would do a double on Saturday and a double on Sunday plus 5 days a week.
Exactly. You would have those double shots. And if you were a top star, Mad Dog definitely qualifies as this. You're wrestling every day. You're wrestling through, knee injuries, back injuries, neck injuries. These injuries, you can't get off the road because if you leave the road, you don't get paid. And so it's not just, being tough, but you had to be durable. And then when you left the ring and you got out into the real world, you were in character 24/7 because people associated, you with your character. You were your character. And that was the cost. LL brought up the point. You see a lot of guys that wound up in prison or jail. You see so many guys, especially from the 80s, that wound up with drug problems. You medicated to keep going. It wasn't that you were partying all the time. Now, some did. Michael Hayes, looking at you. But there were many who needed the drugs just to function because it was such a difficult life. And
Shawn Michaels. Look at all the drugs Shawn Michaels did because of back injury and everything else. It wasn't just for recreation. It was that guy was wrestling in pain.
Yes.
Look at the drug problem that Kurt Angle had.
Yes.
Yeah.
A lot of them did.
Yeah, it's the people today, the newer fans that have only started watching in the last 5 years, they are blessed with this respect. No, the wrestling is not as good, I would argue, but the style that is worked, the number of days that people work today, and the company's penchant for trying to put a good PR image forward protects wrestlers today in a way that they weren't protected 30, 40 years ago.
No.
And
use Daniel Bryan. Look at him with the concussions.
Exactly. It's
Bailey and
Look at Edge and his neck injury. Look at Paige and her neck injury.
look at what I say, Bailey and Finn. They got hurt. Finn still won the title, but he had to give it up the next day because of his serious shoulder injury. Now we know about that stuff. We're
now.
in the 60s, 70s, 80s. You didn't hear about any of that.
Yeah, it's the professional, the medical care that they get now in the arenas during the matches. You know, that wrestling is a tough sport no matter what area you're in, but people today are lucky. I don't think you're going to see the same phenomenon that, you know, Adam, I know you experienced it because me and you, we were watching the same period. We kind of grew up in the same general area. How many guys from the 90s and 2000s died premature death because wrestling just took such a toll on them? Taker, you and LL, you can go even further back into the 70s and 80s. Some of the guys that, you know, had such promise that passed away before their time. You know, Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert, you know, Adrian Adonis had the car wreck. You had, you know, drugs destroy Dynamite Kid's career where he's left, you know, in a wheelchair now.
Kurt Hennig.
Kurt Hennig died before his time.
Because of drugs. And you got Luna Vachon. You got Davey Boy Smith. All to do with drugs.
It's a tragic list. You know, Luna Vachon, you know, you brought up Luna Vachon, and, you know, Luna was such a pervasive part of the WWF in the 90s, off and on, especially in the Attitude Era. I remember Luna Vachon very well. I'm sure you do too.
I do.
It's, you know, it's all of these personalities.
She was the most vicious woman to ever wrestle.
Yeah.
And you think of this. Look at the suicides. Eddie Guerrero.
No, Eddie Guerrero died of enlarged heart due to drug use.
Yeah, he died of a heart
actually
attack.
Well, there was two things because there was reports of it being a suicide.
No, it was an enlarged heart due to his use of drugs over his life.
Yeah.
Plus, there were traces of drugs in his system.
But you also got you got the suicides.
Yeah, the people who just couldn't.
There's one I'm going to bring up that nobody likes to hear about. Chris Benoit. All the drugs, the concussions, everything it did to him, it ruined his brain. Look what he did. There's so much damage that these guys went through then that nobody knew about. We just got the aftermath.
You said it yourself, Biff, that if you started watching wrestling within the last 5 to 7 years, you're blessed in that you do not have to wake up every other day and seeing that someone else had died.
Yeah.
That didn't need to.
It was soul crushing. You would be sitting there going, another one? Seriously? And Luna was one of those.
Yeah.
China. Look at China.
Yeah.
There's another.
There's a lot.
I want to focus on Luna for a second because when you go back and look at the career of Luna Vachon, you see this impeccable presence of a woman who didn't look like. Nia Jax has this tagline, not like most girls. That was Luna Vachon.
That's Luna.
That's Luna.
And the crazy thing is, and I looked this up because I wanted to be sure, she never won a major promotions women's championship.
No, she did not.
She was never the champion. She was always the bridesmaid.
Oh, wait. She wasn't. Yeah, she was American Wrestling Federation champion once.
That was it.
That was it.
For as long as she worked for the WWF, she never won their title. She didn't win the AWA championship because by that time, no one really, they were gone, essentially. Even though there was an AWA Women's Championship. WCW really didn't have one. So she came about in this era where she was in the right spot at a lot of places. But she was never given the strap because she didn't look like other girls. And that's what it boiled down to.
Her look and another thing, she took the one thing I always liked about her character. She had the gruff, gravelly voice that was associated with Maurice, her uncle.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
She was Butcher's stepdaughter.
Adopted stepdaughter.
Both Paul and Maurice did not want her into business.
Andre, one of her great friends, did not want her in the business.
Yeah.
Andre himself tried to convince her to stay out.
I got to jump in here on this one because Luna, this one's hard for me because Luna Vachon is one of the instances in wrestling where the character on screen does not match the character behind the scenes.
Absolutely.
Luna Vachon was as respected and loved by her peers in the business as she was hated by the fans in the ring. And you know, Luna, she had a very famous spat with Sable that wound up costing her job, obviously. But other than this instance, every story you hear about Luna Vachon is, you know, she helped women, you know, advance. She helped them get better in the ring. She cared about what happened to them. She took care of the people she worked with. She took care of Sable in their feuds, even though Sable was an untrained, you know, valet at this point when she got into the ring in '98. Adam, you remember the Luna Vachon Sable feud? I'm sure
I do.
Yeah, we were the perfect age where we kind of, you know, gravitated toward that, but you know what I'm talking about.
Look, very few women looked like Sable, and very few women looked like Luna. But the thing about it was, and this is it. I'm sorry. I'm not going to have anything nice to say about Sable here. Sorry.
Nobody does.
She was a bitch. She was a bitch who understood her role and used it against people.
If Brock Lesnar's listening to this, I would like to make it known Adam Rice said that Connoisseurs of Wrestling do not necessarily condone all the opinions expressed on the show. Continue, Adam.
I hate you. But
at least we didn't give him your location.
Thank you.
Columbus.
I hate you all so much. But that feud led to Luna getting legitimately hurt because Sable couldn't work.
Yeah.
Which should be. I could go into a diatribe about all the careers Sable's killed.
But it would take all day.
And I don't have that kind of time.
Yeah, and we need to start wrapping this up because we're pushing the limit here. I need to get my hiney off to bed.
Yeah, this is just kind of goes to show you what you can do when you have a great subject. We could talk for hours about this, but
I think
that's the problem with this show, is that we always have great subjects.
I will just say is that Luna was one of the first who stood there and said, this hypersexualization of women in wrestling is wrong and it needs to change.
That's why she left the WWE.
Remember, they did one of those stupid lingerie contests, and Luna was out there, but she didn't disrobe. And she didn't disrobe because she said enough is enough. And it cost her job.
Luna had a very tough end to her life. She had a house fire that destroyed a lot of her memorabilia. It basically rendered her homeless at one point. And, you know, Luna Vachon, she deserved a better ending than she got, both in wrestling and in life. But I want to make it very clear to people listening, and we're going to end on this point here because we're pushing on 2 hours now. You know, Luna, she doesn't get the credit, nearly enough credit that she deserves for being a revolutionary figure in women's wrestling in an era when it was hypersexualized. The Attitude Era was all about sexuality, and you know that mindset would pervade WWE's thinking for the next 10 years, even into the 2000s, with the hiring women out of swimsuit catalogs that has been told many times before. But Luna Vachon, despite the tragic ending to her life, she represents, you know, some of the best qualities in wrestling, something that only a member of a prominent wrestling family could truly appreciate. She took care of you in the ring, and she protected the business, and she protected the integrity of her craft. And that's why she did what she did. Luna Vachon deserves a lot of respect for what she did in an era when it was career suicide for her to do it. And unfortunately, you know, her life ended in such a tragic way. I just want to make it known that if there's anyone deserving of respect, especially in that era, it's Luna Vachon. She had an amazing career for herself, and she stuck to her guns, and she carried on the Vachon name very proudly. And that's what we want to focus on here at the Connoisseurs of Wrestling, the great families of the AWA. You know, Warren Bockwinkel never had much influence. He was out of the business before the AWA even started. But Nick's contributions to the AWA, what Warren did for Nick, what Vern did for Greg, you know, the Vachon family and how they all coalesced. You know, there's just this passion for wrestling that's present through every stage. And there's another family of the AWA that is a little bit conspicuous by their absence. The Hennig family, who we're going to be talking about at some point in this week. And this is a segue to our wrap up here. Of course, we've been doing our special shows on the families of wrestling. If you saw last night in the nightly thread, we began a countdown of the 10 greatest families. I will say this as a brief spoiler: the Hennigs are on the list, but you got to tune into the nightly threads this week to see where they fall on the list. Now, here's how this is going to work. It was explained a little bit last night, and I'll double down on it here. We're going to be doing another family each night this week through Saturday. Families number 10 through 7 will be on the countdown with a new family listed each night. This coming Sunday, June 24th, will be the final episode of our Great Family series, and we will conclude the countdown that we begin in the nightly threads with the top 3 families. So that's kind of a teaser for next week's episode. The only reason we're giving that teaser out is because you know that obviously we're counting down. So next week's show, we're going to have the 3 big families. A little bit of a housekeeping note on that show. LL will not be with us next week, but we're going to have...
Yes, I will. It's the following Sunday that I may not.
Oh, I'm an idiot. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, her surgery is on the 29th.
Oh, okay.
First, I may and I may not.
Gotcha. Okay. So for all of you listening, ignore that last part and just Control-Alt-Delete it. LL will be here next week. Never mind. LL will be here next week for the final of the countdown. It's the week after where she won't be available. But we'll cross that bridge in 2 weeks when we get closer to it. But next week, the countdown of the final 3 will conclude. That'll be a final in our series of the great families of wrestling that we've been doing here in June. The week after that, which will be the first show in July, we're going to have our next Hall of Fame induction. And speaking of Hall of Fame, of course, you know, we talked about it at the start of the show. Group B voting is about to open. If its thread is not up, it will be up here very shortly. Of course, Ric Flair was the walkaway winner in Group A. Of course, Group B, an even tougher group featuring some of the great wrestlers from the 80s and early 90s of the WWF. Randy Savage, Hulk Hogan, The Ultimate Warrior, Andre the Giant, and Jake the Snake Roberts. That is your Group B. Voting will continue on for the rest of this week and conclude next Monday. The winner will join Ric Flair on the final ballot to be released here in a couple of weeks. This is for our August 5th show. It is the first time that the fans of the Connoisseurs of Wrestling will be choosing the Hall of Fame inductee for August. We already have our Hall of Fame inductee lined up next month. That'll be in 2 weeks' time.
And that's a family that's going in.
Yeah, it's a wrestling family. We're going to continue on with that trend. Want to get some plugs in here because we always have shows we want to plug, and then we're going to get some contact information where we can find everybody here on the show. First of all, the Cageside Seats affiliated podcast, we'd like to plug the Bitter Boys Club with Brent Brookhouse and Ethan Page. Not Your Demographic with Stunning Stella and Enigma Aaron. We have Keeping Up with the Kayfabe, Mark Riley, Jody May Esquire, and Jack King. And, of course, Bros Before Elbows with Anthony Farron and Tommy. We also have a series of unaffiliated podcasts that we'd love to give some love to. Of course, we can't go without mentioning Two Guys, One Sport, Crazy Chris Colgan and George Curtin, Jerker Atzaves. Our good friend, Fizzy's Wacky World of Wrestling with William Fitzpatrick. The Violet Wrestling Podcast, Ambrose Alley and Prince Moxley Lopez, Match Fixin' with Don Sal Cusmano on the Cedar Bridge Media Network. We also have Wednesday Night Shooting with Tanya Rogers and Andrew M. Swift. Miss Monroe and Company have Ringside Geeks and For the Love of Wrestling. We have the Ruthless Aggression Era podcast with Metal Matt. We also like to toss some love out to Conrad Thompson's shows, Something to Wrestle with Bruce Pritchard and Something Else to Wrestle with on the WWE Network. And, of course, What Happened When with Conrad Thompson and Tony Schiavone. I'd like to throw out a link to Jason Solomon, The Solomon Monster Sounds Off. He has an excellent podcast to keep up with. And a little bit of a special note about podcasting plugs going to be coming at you next week. I'm not going to spoil it. Let's just say there's a new show coming in the future. So be on the lookout for that. But that is our little coterie of shows that we like to plug here. If you have a show that you do that you would like to have referenced here, find us on Cageside Seats, ask for a reference, and we'll be happy to help you out if you're cool peoples. You be cool, you stay cool. I want to send a very special thank you to Adam Rice for joining us here today. Adam, we took up 2 hours of your Sunday, but I'm guessing you enjoyed yourself here.
I enjoyed myself immensely, and if there's ever an opportunity that I am able to come back, I'm at your guys' disposal.
Absolutely, and we want to thank you again for being with us. Where can they find you, Adam? Where can they contact you?
If anybody out there wants to reach me, talk about wrestling, anything, you can find me on Twitter at PWFan01. There's a giant logo of the Ohio State University, the single greatest football playing university in these United States.
Bullshit.
And
Go Bama.
Since you guys have something in the back of your throat, I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, it's called National Championships.
No, I wouldn't say that.
Yes, ma'am.
And for those of you who want to, for some reason, want to hear my opinions about something related in the wrestling world again, I'm on Cageside Seats during the week and in the nightly, mostly on the weekends. And then on June 29th, I know he hasn't gone about announcing it yet, but on June 29th, I will be appearing on the Ruthless Aggression Era podcast with Metal Matt talking about No Way Out 2003.
Oh, you're going to have a lot of fun on that show. Metal Matt does a really great job. It's a really fun experience. You're going to love that. LL, where can they find you at?
You can find me at Windstorm64 on Twitter. The daily and the nightly, I do pop in every so often. And right here at Connoisseurs of Wrestling.
And Taker, we got to get your contact information. Of course, we'd be remiss without mentioning the Godfathers podcast, the Shoot the Breeze podcast, Saturday mornings, 11 a.m. Eastern here on YouTube, 10 a.m. Eastern on the weekends of the big 4 pay-per-views. Other than that, Taker, where can they find you these days, good friend?
You can find me on Twitter at Takers_Minion. I do answer some tweets. It may take me a while to get to them because I don't monitor it like most people. You can also find me on the daily, on Cageside Seats, and the nightly as well. I am the voice of reason for most of the time on both of those threads.
You are the Taskmaster.
No, the voice of reason. When people seem to get into arguments, I'm always jumping into the middle of it and trying to calm it down.
I like Taskmaster. The Taskmaster is a nice ring to it. The Taskmaster, Taker's minion. Run with it. It works.
Okay, if you say so.
Happy birthday, Mr. President.
Oh, jeez. That's a week old now.
Well, hey, we're counting down to your next birthday.
It's a long way off.
I've got patience.
And damn it, I'm going to be 55. Ugh, I don't even want to think about it. I can order off the senior menu at restaurants. Yay!
Okay, Biff. Where can they find you?
Not very many places moving forward. I mean, you can occasionally find me at Cageside Seats. I'll generally get into fights in the daily or nightly thread. I'm working on doing better about that. Don't have a lot to repeat right now in terms of show information. The Queen City Express has come to an end. Unfortunately, Ryan and I couldn't work out a schedule with his work to get him on, and I'm not going to lather on independently. Got a new show in the pipes, working its way to fruition. I'll have more information on that coming up. You can find me on the Twitter at RealDealBiff. Of course, our contact information for the show is in the info box down below. Connoisseurs of Wrestling at gmail.com or Connoisseurs of Wrestling at Twitter. Let me try that again. On Twitter at Connoisseurs of Wrestling. You can find all our contact.
The one for our Twitter, if they want to put the name in, they just put Connoisseurs off. And then they can get in that way.
Yeah.
So, Connoisseurs of Wrestling did not fit too many characters.
So
okay.
So it comes up Connoisseurs of to get in.
Okay. So, yeah, programming note on that one. If you want to tweet the show, by all means, go ahead. Email the show. Keep in touch. We'd love to hear from you. You know, you've been so good to us, being active in our threads, participating in our chats. Just want to say a special thank you again to Adam for joining us here today. This is episode 9, The Great Families of the American Wrestling Association. You've been listening to a special edition of the Connoisseurs of Wrestling. Be sure to be in the nightly thread this week, guys. It's Connoisseurs of Wrestling week in the nightly all week. And we'll see you back here next Saturday. Good Lord, you can tell I'm tired. Next Sunday for episode 10 of the Connoisseurs of Wrestling. Go vote in Group B. Thanks for everyone that's been listening. I am Biff Kensington, and we're out. Have a good one, guys.
See y'all later.
Bye.
Ohio State, my ass.